Chapter 12 The Wonderful Machine. Next day, Pa cut the heads from several bundles of the oats and brought the clean, bright yellow straws to Ma. She put them in a tub of water to soften them and keep them soft. Then she sat in the chair by the side of the tub and braided the straws. She took up several of them and knotted their ends together and began to braid. The straws were different lengths, and when she came near one end, she put a new long one from the tub in its place, and she went on braiding. She let the end of the braid fall back into the water and keep on braiding till she had many yards of braid. All of her spare time for days she was braiding straws. She made fine, narrow, smooth braid using 7 of the smallest straws. She used 9 larger straws for a wide braid and made it notched all along the edges. And from the very longest straws, she made the widest braid of all. When all the straws were braided, she threaded a needle with a strong white thread, and she began at the end of the braid, and she sewed it round and round, holding the braid so it would lay flat after it was sewed. This made a little mat, and Ma said that she would top the crown of a hat. Then she held the braid tighter on one edge and kept on sewing around and around. The braid drew in and made the sides of the crown. When the crown was high enough, Ma held the braid loosely again, and she kept on sewing around, and the braid lay flat and was the hat brim. Here's a picture of the hats she made. Pretty neat. When the brim was wide enough, Ma cut the braid and sewed the end fast so that it could not unbraid itself. Ma sewed hats for Mary and Laura of the finest, narrowest braid. For Pa and for herself, she made hats of a wider, notched braid. That was Pa's Sunday hat, when she made him 2 everyday hats for the coarser wide braid, with the coarser wide braid. She finished a hat. Ma set it on a board to dry and shape it nicely. So as she did so, and when it dried and stayed in that shape, she gave it. Ma could make beautiful hats. Laura liked to watch her, and she learned how to braid the straw to make a little hat for her Charlotte. The days were growing shorter and the nights were getting cooler, and one night Jack Frost passed by, and in the morning there were bright colors here and among the green leaves in the big woods. Then all the leaves stopped being green. They were yellow and scarlet, crimson and golden brown. Along the rail fence, the sumac held up its dark red cones of berries above the bright flame-colored leaves. Acorns were falling from the oaks, and Laura and Mary made little acorn cups and saucers for their playhouse. Walnuts and hickory nuts were dropping to the ground in the big woods, and the squirrels were scampering busily everywhere, gathering their winter store of nuts and hiding them away in the hollow trees. Laura and Mary went with Ma to gather walnuts and hickory nuts and hazelnuts. They spread them in the sun to dry. Then they beat off the dried outer hulls and stored the nuts in the attic for winter. It was fun to gather the large round walnuts and the smaller hickory nuts and the little hazelnuts that grew in bunches on the bushes. The soft outer hulls of the walnuts were full of a brown juice that stained their hands, but the hazelnut holes smelled good and tasted good too. Then Laura used her teeth to pry a nut loose. Everyone was busy now, for all the garden vegetables must be stored away. Laura and Mary helped picking up the dusty potatoes after Pa had dug them from the ground, and pulled the long yellow carrots and the round purple-topped turnips, and they helped Ma cook the pumpkin for pumpkin pies. With the butcher knife, Ma cut a big orange-colored pumpkin in half. She cleaned the seeds out of the center and cut the pumpkin into large slices, from which she pared the rind. Laura helped her cut the slices into cubes. Ma put the cubes in a big iron pot on the stove and poured some water, and then watched while the pumpkin slowly boiled down all day long. All the water and the juice must be boiled away, and the pumpkin must never burn. The pumpkin was thick, dark, good-smelling mass in the kettle. It did not boil like water, but bubbles came up and suddenly exploded, leaving holes that closed quickly. Every time a bubble exploded, a rich, hot pumpkin smell came out. Laura stood on a chair and watched the pumpkin for Ma and stirred it with the wooden paddle. She held the paddle in both hands and stirred carefully because if the pumpkin burned, there would be no pumpkin pies. For dinner, they ate stewed pumpkin with their bread. They made it into pretty shapes on their plate. It was a beautiful color and smooth and molded so prettily with their knives. Ma never allowed them to play with their food at the table. They must always eat nicely, and everything was set before them, leaving nothing on their plates when they were done. But she did let them make the rich brown stewed pumpkin into pretty shapes before they ate it. At other times, they had baked Hubbard squash for dinner. The rind was so hard that Ma took Pa's axe to cut the squash into pieces. When the pieces were baked in the oven, Laura loved to spread the soft insides with butter and scoop the yellow flesh from the rind and eat it. For supper now, they often had hulled corn and milk. That was good too. It was so good that Laura could hardly wait for corn to be ready after Ma started to hull it. It took 2 or 3 days to make hulled corn. The first day, Ma cleaned and brushed all the ashes out of the cook stove. Then she burned some clean, bright hardwood and saved its ashes. She put the hardwood ashes in a little cloth bag. That night, Pa brought in some ears of corn with large, plump kernels. He nubbed the ears, shelling off the small, chafy kernels at their tips. Then he shelled the rest of the large pan until the pan was full. Early the next morning, Ma put the shelled corn and the bags of ashes into the big iron kettle. She filled the kettle with water and kept it boiling for a long time. At last, the kernels of corn began to swell, and they swelled and swelled until the skins split and began to peel off. When every skin was loose and peeling, Ma lugged the heavy kettle outdoors. She filled a clean tub with cold water from the spring, and she dipped the corn out of the kettle into the tub. Here is a picture of Ma. Then she rolled up her sleeves and her flowered calico dress above her elbows, and she knelt down by the tub. With her hands, she rubbed and scrubbed the corn until the holes came off and floated on top of the water. Often she poured the water off and filled the tub again with buckets of water from the spring. She kept on rubbing and scrubbing the corn between her hands and changing the water until every hole came off and she was washed away. Ma looked pretty with her bare arms plump and white, her cheeks so red, and her dark hair smooth and shining while she scrubbed and rubbed the corn in the clear water. She never splashed one drop of water on her pretty dress. When at the last the corn was done, Ma put all the soft white kernels in a big jar in the pantry. Then at last they had hulled the corn and the milk for supper. Sometimes they had hulled corn for breakfast with maple syrup, and sometimes Ma fried the soft kernels in pork drippings. But Laura liked it best with milk. Autumn was great fun. There was so much work to do and so many good things to eat and so many new things to see. Laura was scampering and chattering like the squirrels from morning till night. One frosty morning, a machine came up the road. 4 horses were pulling it, and 2 men were on it. The horses hauled it up into the field where Pa and Uncle Henry and Grandpa and Mr. Peterson had stacked their wheat. 2 more men drove after it another smaller machine. Pa called to Ma that the threshers had come. They had hurried out to the field with his team. Laura and Mary called Ma. Then they ran out to the field before him. They might watch if they were careful not to get in the way. Uncle Henry came riding up and tied his horse to the tree. Then he and Pa hitched all the other horses, 8 of them, to the smaller machine. Here's a picture. They hitched each team to the end of a long stick, and they came out from the center of the machine. A long iron rod lay along the ground from this machine to the big machine. Afterward, Laura and Mary asked questions, and Pa told them that the big machine was called a separator, and the rod was called the tumbling rod, and the little machine was called the horsepower. 8 horses were hitched to it and made it go. So this was an 8 horsepower machine. The man sat on top of the horsepower, and when everything was ready, he clucked to the horses, and they began to go. They walked around in a circle, each team pulling on the long stick to which it was hitched, and followed the team ahead. As they went around, they stepped carefully over the tumbling rod, which was tumbling over and over on the ground. Their pulling made the tumbling rod keep rolling over, and the rod moved the machinery of the separator, which stood beside the stack of wheat. All this machinery made an enormous racket. Rackety bang and clanging. Laura and Mary held tight each other's hand at the edge of the field and watched with their eyes. They had never seen a machine before. They had never heard such racket. Pa and Uncle Henry, on top of the wheat stack, were pitching bundles down onto the board. A man stood on the board and cut the bands on the bundles and crowded the bundles one at a time into a hole at the end of the separator. The hole looked like the separator's mouth. It had long iron teeth. The teeth were chewing. They chewed the bundles, and the separator swallowed them. Straw blew out the separator's other end, and the wheat poured out its side. Two men were working fast, trampling the straw and building it into a stack. One man was working fast, stacking and pouring the grain. The grains of wheat poured out the separator into a half-bushel measure, and as fast as the measure filled, the man slipped an empty one into its place and emptied the full one into a sack. He had just time to empty it and slip it back under the spout before another measure ran out. All the men were working as fast as they possibly could, but the machine kept right up with them. Laura and Mary were so excited they could hardly breathe. They held hands tightly and stared. The horses walked around and around. The man who was driving them cracked his whip and shouted, "Giddy up there, John. No use trying to shirk. Crack them that whip. Careful there, Billy. Easy, boy. You can't go but so fast now. Know how." The separator swallowed the bundles. The golden grain blew out in a golden cloud. The wheat streamed golden brown out the spout while the men hurried. Pa and Uncle Henry pitched the bundles down as fast as they could, and the chaff and the dust blew over everything. I'm going to show you that picture again. Let's see if you can see the mouth. Oh, this must be where the separator, where they put in the bundles and out comes the straw. And over here, they're sacking up the grain. All this machinery made an enormous racket. Oops, I read that. They ran back to the house to help Ma get dinner ready for all those men. The big kettle of cabbage and the meat were boiling on the stove. A big pan of beans and Johnny cake were baking in the oven. Laura and Mary set the table for the threshers. They put on salt rising bread and butter, bowls of stewed pumpkin pies and dried berry pies, cookies, cheese and honey, and pitchers of milk. Then Ma put on the boiling potatoes, cabbage and meat, baked beans, and hot Johnny cake, and a baked Hubbard squash, and she poured the tea. Laura always wondered why bread made of cornmeal was called Johnny cake. It isn't a cake. Ma didn't know, unless the Northern soldiers called it Johnny cake because the people in the South, where they fought, ate so much of it. They called the Southern soldiers Johnny Rebs. Maybe they called the Southern bread cake just for fun. Ma had heard some say that it should be called Johnny cake. She didn't know. It wouldn't be very good bread to take on a journey. At noon, the threshers came in to the table loaded with food, but there was none too much for the threshers. Worked hard to get and got very hungry. By the middle of the afternoon, the machines had finished all their threshing, and the men who owned them drove them away into the big woods, taking with them the sacks of wheat that were their pay. They were going to the next place where the neighbors were stacking their wheat and wanted the machines to thresh. Pa was very tired that night, but he was happy. He said to Ma, "It would have taken Uncle Henry and Peterson and Pa and me a couple of weeks apiece to thresh that much grain with flails as the machine threshed today. We wouldn't have got as much wheat either, and it wouldn't have been as clean. That machine is a great invention, he said. Other folks can stick to old-fashioned ways if they want to, but I'm all for progress. It's a great age we're living in. As long as I can raise wheat, I'm going to have a machine come and thresh it, if there's one anywhere in the neighborhood. He was too tired that night to talk to Laura, but Laura was proud of him. It was Pa who had got the other men to stack their wheat together and send for the threshing machine. It was a wonderful machine, and everyone was glad that it had come. And that is the end of chapter 12. Make it a great day or not. The choice is yours, and I hope it's a good one.